The smile that named the tale, when a plantation heir waits at the fence for one child's smile, her gift for reading seals exposes a forged pass and unlocks a hidden freedom clause. A young plantation heir stands at the weathered fence each dawn, waiting for one shy smile from a small enslaved girl with perfect pitch and eyes that read truth in letters. When night patrollers flash official papers to seize children after curfew, she whispers the shocking truth. The state seal curves backward, the wheat sprig is missing, the pass is forged. But in the dusty attic of the big house, loose threads in a family Bible reveal something no one expected, a hidden manumission clause, sealed in red wax, with names that could change everything. Storm waters rise. Church bells ring their warning. Lanterns move through the darkness. The courthouse steps await, where a child must stand before judge and jury to sing the truth that could set her free. When the flood waters recede and the papers are laid bare under lamplight, will a mother's secret promise written in fading ink be enough to break the chains of bondage, or will the banker's ledger silence a song of freedom forever? The cypress trees held their breath at daybreak. Elias Boone stood at the weathered fence that divided the big house from the quarters, watching steam rise from Aunt Scylla's kitchen window. Inside, horehound and mint leaves twisted in hot water, brewing medicine for a cough that rattled through the morning air. He balanced a cloth bundle on the fence rail, 2 buttermilk biscuits, still warm from the oven. Every rich girl in 3 counties wanted him. That's what the kitchen hands whispered, shoulders bent over washboards, sleeves rolled past their elbows. They said Miss Caroline Thorne had embroidered his initials on her handkerchief. They said Miss Adelaide Crane had practiced his surname with her own, writing it in careful loops across her writing paper. But Elias waited here. The quarters door creaked on leather hinges. A small girl stepped out, bare feet silent on the packed earth. Liddy moved like water, all grace and careful quiet. Her hair caught the early light in bronze waves. Around her neck hung a thin ribbon holding a brass locket, tarnished but treasured. She saw the biscuits. Her face tilted up, and there it was, the smile that made him rise before dawn. Soft as candle flame, steady as a lighthouse beacon. It lasted only a moment before she ducked her chin, but that moment held enough light to carry him through any darkness. "Morning, Miss Liddy," he said, voice low enough that the kitchen windows wouldn't catch it. She dipped a curtsy, eyes dancing. "Morning, Master Elias." From the swept porch of the nearest cabin, an old woman rocked in a chair made of bent wood and woven rope. Aunt Scylla's weathered hands never stilled, always knotting, always mending, always finding work for idle fingers. Steam still curled from her kitchen, and she hummed a tune without words while she watched the dawn meeting at the fence. "That child's got perfect pitch," Aunt Scylla had told him once, needle flashing through a torn seam. "Hear her hum a hymn Sunday morning. You'll remember it come Christmas. God gave that girl ears for more than trouble." Liddy reached for a broom leaning against the cabin wall. It was worn smooth by 1,000 sweepings, the handle carved with tiny notches that caught the light. She began to sweep the hard-packed earth in front of the door, but the broom moved in rhythm, tap, 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 pause, tap like drum beats for a march that existed only in her head. The yard dogs, stretched lazy in the warming air, lifted their heads. At the sound of Liddy's rhythm, they settled deeper into the dirt, ears relaxed, tails still. Even the roosters seemed to time their crowing to her steady beat. Elias leaned against the fence post, arms crossed over his chest. His mother had died 3 springs ago, leaving him heir to 500 acres, 42 souls, and debts that grew like kudzu in wet seasons. He should be in the big house, reviewing ledgers with his father's old lawyer. He should be calling on Miss Caroline or Miss Adelaide, playing the part of the eligible gentleman, securing his future with the right marriage to the right fortune. Instead, he lingered here, watching a child sweep earth that would be dirty again by sunset. The breakfast bell clanged from the big house, sharp and demanding. Aunt Scylla's rocker stilled. Kitchen smoke thickened as girls hurried to start the morning meal. In the distance, field hands gathered at the tool shed, hoes and axes catching the slanted light. But before the morning scattered them all in different directions, Liddy looked up one more time. Her smile rose like a small flame, steady against the damp. Then the moment broke. Boots crunched on gravel. Rook, the overseer, rounded the corner of the nearest cabin with a leather ledger tucked under his arm and a pencil behind his ear. He was a thin man with sharp elbows and eyes like winter water, cold and clear and cutting. His coat hung loose on his frame, but his voice carried weight that his body lacked. "Morning, Master Elias," Rook said, touching the brim of his hat. His gaze flicked to the fence rail, to the biscuits, to Liddy's downturned face. "Generous of you, sharing the kitchen stores." Heat climbed Elias's neck. "Morning, Rook." Liddy had gone still, broom handle gripped tight in both hands. The rhythmic sweeping stopped. Even the dogs sensed the change, ears pricked forward, bodies tense. Rook unrolled his ledger and balanced it against his forearm. Pages rustled in the morning breeze. Columns of numbers marched down the paper in neat rows: names, ages, work assignments, estimated values. At the top of each page, a heading in Rook's careful script: Inventory. "Been doing some calculations," Rook said, licking the tip of his pencil. "Estate's running lean. Might need to make some adjustments before the bank comes calling." The words hung in the air like smoke from a green wood fire, bitter and hard to breathe. Elias pushed away from the fence. "What kind of adjustments?" "Inventory reduction." Rook's pencil tapped against the ledger. "Too many mouths that don't earn their feed. Children, mostly. Old folks past their working years." Liddy's knuckles had gone white around the broom handle. She stood perfectly still, but Elias could see her counting under her breath, a silent rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. Other children had begun to gather. A boy of perhaps 10, tall for his age, with eyes like deep water. Twin girls who shared everything, from hair ribbons to whispered secrets. A baby who had just learned to walk, toddling between the cabins on unsteady legs. Rook pulled a measuring stick from his coat pocket. "Need to check heights. Market value depends on size, potential for field work." He moved toward the nearest cabin, where the tall boy stood frozen in the doorway. Rook held the stick against the door frame, marking a line with his pencil. "James, step here." The boy looked to Liddy. She hummed 2 soft notes, low, then high, and somehow those notes carried a message. The yard dogs settled onto their bellies, calm despite the tension. James's shoulders relaxed just enough to let him move. But as he stepped to the measuring stick, Elias saw red spots bloom on Rook's ledger where the pencil point had pressed too hard, digging through paper like a blade. On the last line of the page, in letters that seemed to burn, "One light girl, quick-tongued." The morning's peace shattered like thin ice. That night, wheels creaked on the lane that led to the big house. Elias heard them from his second-floor window, where he sat with law books spread across his desk and lamp oil burning low in the wick. He set down his pen and moved to the window, pulling back heavy curtains that his mother had sewn by hand. A wagon stood in the circular drive, drawn by 2 mules with heads hung low. The driver wore a patroller's badge pinned to his coat, a star of tin that caught the moonlight. Behind him, 2 men sat on the wagon bed, legs swinging over the side. Rook emerged from the overseer's house, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the gravel. In his other hand, a folded paper, thick stock, sealed with red wax. Elias pulled on his boots and coat, slipping down the back stairs and out through the kitchen door. He moved through the darkness between the big house and the quarters, using the vegetable garden's rows to muffle his footsteps. The patroller's voice carried on the night air. "Got authorization to move young stock after curfew. Bank's orders." He held up the paper, letting the lantern light catch the official seal. Rook examined the document, tilting it toward the flame. "All in order?" "Course it is. State seal, proper signatures, Latin motto around the edge. You want to question the bank's authority." But, from her place in the shadows near Aunt Scylla's cabin, Liddy stepped forward. Her bare feet made no sound on the packed earth, but her voice carried clearly in the still air. "The motto's backward," she whispered. Every head turned. The patroller's face darkened. "What you say, girl?" Liddy's fingers found her locket, worrying the tarnished brass. The Latin words. They curve the wrong way around the seal. And the wheat sprig state seal always has a wheat sprig on the left side. This one's missing. Elias's breath caught. He stepped out of the shadows, boots crunching on gravel. "She's right." The patroller's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be, questioning legal documents in the middle of the night?" "Elias Boone." "This is my property." He held out his hand. "Let me see that pass." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the patroller reluctantly handed over the paper. Elias held it close to Rook's lantern, studying the seal in the flickering light. The wax was red, but not the deep crimson of official documents. This red had an orange undertone, like brick dust mixed with candle wax. The impression was slightly blurred, as if the seal had been pressed too quickly or into wax that was too warm. And just as Liddy had said, the Latin motto curved in the wrong direction, and the wheat sprig that should have balanced the scales of justice was nowhere to be found. "This is forged," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. The patroller snatched the paper back, but his face had gone pale. "You calling me a liar? I'm calling this paper false. No child leaves this property tonight." The wagon men shifted restlessly. One spat tobacco juice into the dust. The other fingered the handle of a knife at his belt, but Rook stepped between them, lantern held high. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Easy enough to check with the courthouse come morning." The patroller stuffed the paper inside his coat, red wax catching the light one last time before it disappeared. Under the lantern's tilt, that wrong red wax had glistened like a wound, bright and wet and dangerous. "This ain't over," the patroller said, climbing back onto his wagon seat. The mules stirred, harness jingling. "Bank's got other ways to collect what's owed." The wagon rolled away into the darkness, wheels creaking and mules snorting, but the threat hung in the air long after the sound of hooves faded. Elias looked down at Liddy, who still stood with her fingers wrapped around her locket. In the lantern light, her eyes seemed older than her, years too old, too knowing, too aware of the dangers that walked in the dark. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. She tilted her head, considering. "Letters have their own music. Wrong letters make the wrong song." Aunt Scylla appeared in her cabin doorway, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "Child's got eyes for more than most," she said, voice carrying the weight of years. "Always did. Even as a baby, she'd study things, seals on medicine bottles, writing on flour sacks, anything with letters or marks. Mind like a trap, that one." Rook closed his ledger with a snap. Clever girl or not, the bank's still coming. Numbers don't lie, even if passes do. He walked back toward his house, lantern swinging at his side. In the growing darkness, Elias could hear him muttering under his breath calculations and estimates, debts and interests, the cold mathematics of human lives reduced to columns in a book. But Liddy began to hum soft and low, a melody without words. The sound drifted across the quiet yard like smoke from a distant fire. It was a hymn Elias recognized from Sunday services, but changed somehow. Different verses, different rhythm, different meaning, hidden in the familiar tune. The dogs settled at the sound. The night insects resumed their chorus. Even the wind seemed to gentle, stirring the cypress branches with softer fingers, and somewhere in that melody, Elias heard something he hadn't expected: hope. The next morning brought Sunday, and with it the ritual of church attendance. Elias dressed in his best coat, the one his mother had insisted on having tailored in Richmond. Dark wool, brass buttons, cut to show his shoulders and height to advantage. In the mirror, he looked every inch the plantation, heir handsome, eligible, worthy of the finest marriages. But when he walked down the front steps of the big house, he didn't turn toward the stable where his horse waited, saddled and ready for the ride to town. Instead, he walked to the fence that separated the big house from the quarters. Miss Caroline Thorne was already there, along with Miss Adelaide Crane and 3 other young ladies from neighboring plantations. They stood near the garden gate in their Sunday finery silk dresses in shades of rose and lavender, bonnets trimmed with ribbons, parasols tilted at fashionable angles. "Elias," Miss Caroline called, her voice bright as silver bells. "We were hoping you'd join us for the ride to church. Papa has the large carriage today, and there's plenty of room." Miss Adelaide stepped closer, her parasol spinning lazily above her head. "We could stop at Miller's Creek afterward. The wildflowers are beautiful this time of year, perfect for a picnic." The other young ladies murmured agreement, a chorus of well-bred voices offering the pleasures of proper society carriages and picnics. Conversation and courtship, the comfortable world where gentlemen married fortunes and fortunes married gentlemen. Elias stopped at the fence rail, the same spot where he'd waited that morning and every morning before. In the quarters, families were gathering for their own Sunday preparations. Children in their one good outfit, mothers with hair pinned neat and clean, fathers with faces freshly shaved. And there was Liddy, standing on Aunt Scylla's swept porch in a dress of blue cotton, faded but clean. Her hair was braided with a ribbon that matched her dress, and her locket caught the morning light. She was watching him, waiting to see what choice he would make. The young ladies behind him grew quiet, sensing something shift in the air. Miss Caroline's parasol stopped spinning. Miss Adelaide's smile faltered. "I'll wait right here," Elias said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Same as yesterday, same as every day." He leaned against the fence rail, arms crossed, facing the quarters instead of the garden gate. The statement was clear, unmistakable, public. A murmur ran through the group of young ladies, surprise, disappointment, perhaps the beginning of scandal. But Elias didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the quarters, on the life that most gentlemen chose not to see, and Liddy smiled. It was the same shy, gentle smile she'd given him every morning by the fence, but now it carried new weight. It was her answer to his public choice, her acknowledgement of his courage, her quiet confirmation that some things mattered more than others. The young ladies gathered their skirts and walked toward their carriages, voices lowered but urgent. They would have much to discuss during the drive to church, much to whisper about during the service and after. But Elias remained at the fence, and Liddy remained on the porch, and for that moment the morning held perfect peace. Then Rook appeared from his house, already dressed for town, a fresh sheet of paper tacked to his door. The morning sun struck the notice with merciless clarity. For sale. One light girl, quick-tongued, approximately 12 years, inquire within. The peace shattered. The central conflict locked into place like the tumbler of a closing door. To save Liddy, Elias would have to challenge not just Rook's authority, but the entire system that gave that authority weight: the debts, the bank, the laws that treated people as property. He looked at the sale notice, then at Liddy's face. Her smile had faded, but her chin stayed high. She wasn't begging for his protection. She was simply waiting to see what manner of man he truly was. In the distance, church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to worship. But the real test of faith stood right here, at a weathered fence on a Sunday morning, where a man had to choose between the world he'd inherited and the world he might help create. Elias pushed away from the fence and walked toward Rook's house. Without a word, he tore down the sale notice and crumpled it in his fist. "The girl's not for sale," he said. Rook's eyebrows climbed. "Bank says otherwise. Debts say otherwise. Then I'll talk to the bank. And if the bank won't listen, I'll find someone who will." The crumpled paper felt like a stone in his palm, heavy with the weight of a choice. That couldn't be undone. Behind him, Liddy began to hum that hymn again, the one with verses that seemed to hold secrets, the melody that gentled dogs and settled hearts and carried hope on the morning air. The country chapel sat in a grove of oak trees 2 miles south of the plantation, where the main road forked toward the river. It was a simple building, white clapboard sides, tin roof that sang in the rain, windows of clear glass that let in light without pretension. Preacher Josiah Whitmore had built it with his own hands 20 years ago, after the Lord called him to minister to anyone who would listen, regardless of color or condition. Elias helped Liddy down from the wagon, her hand small and trusting in his. He told Rook she was coming to church on work duties to help Aunt Scylla with the Sunday dinner preparations afterward. It was thin justification, but it would have to serve. Inside the chapel, wooden benches faced a simple altar, no stained glass, no carved angels, just clean lines and honest purpose. A quilt hung behind the pulpit, its squares arranged in a pattern that seemed random at first glance: blue patches next to brown, yellow touching green, dark red against pale yellow. Aunt Scylla settled into a back pew, her church hat pinned secure with a pearl-headed pin that had belonged to her grandmother. Liddy sat beside her, small hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the quilt. Preacher Josiah stepped to the pulpit, a tall man with silver hair and eyes the color of deep water. His voice carried easily through the small space, warm and resonant as a cello. "Let us lift our voices in praise," he said, and opened his worn hymnal. "We'll begin with 'Guide me, O thou great Jehovah.'" The congregation rose, voices joining in the familiar melody. But as they sang, Elias noticed Liddy wasn't following the hymnal. Instead, she sang different words to the same tune. When the shallow belly rises, when the water runs too high, look for 3 lights in the darkness, 1 brown door beneath the sky. The words were so soft that only Elias and Aunt Scylla could hear them. But as Liddy sang, something remarkable happened. Preacher Josiah's voice faltered, his eyes fixed on the child, his face going pale as fresh milk. The hymn ended, but Josiah remained frozen at the pulpit. His gaze moved from Liddy to the quilt behind him, then back to Liddy. In the silence, a clock ticked somewhere in the chapel's rafters. "Child," Josiah said quietly, "where did you learn that verse?" Liddy's fingers found her locket. "My mama sang it, before she went to glory." "Your mama?" Josiah's voice was barely a whisper. "What was your mama's name?" "Ruth. Ruth with the perfect ears," Aunt Scylla used to say. The preacher's hands gripped the pulpit until his knuckles went white. Behind him, the quilt squares suddenly made sense. They weren't random at all. They were a map. Blue for water, brown for buildings, yellow for roads, dark red for danger, pale yellow for safety. And the pattern matched Liddy's verse exactly. After the service, Josiah asked them to remain. The other congregants filed out, voices mixing in the Sunday afternoon air as they discussed dinner plans and week ahead. When the chapel was empty except for their small group, Josiah closed the door and returned to the pulpit. "That song," he said to Liddy. "Sing it again, all the verses you know." Liddy looked to Aunt Scylla, who nodded encouragement. Then, in her clear, sweet voice, she began, "When the shallow belly rises, when the water runs too high, look for 3 lights in the darkness, 1 brown door beneath the sky. Count the poles along the ferry, 7 steps from bank to board. When the bell strikes twice at midnight, trust the rope, believe the word. Follow moss upon the north side, where the old oak holds the lane, till you reach the painted chapel, where the peaceful hearts remain." As she sang, Josiah pulled down the quilt from behind the pulpit. Spread across the altar, its pattern revealed itself fully. Each verse corresponded to a section of the map. The shallow belly was a bend in the river, where the water ran low in dry seasons. The 3 lights marked a safe house, with lanterns in specific windows. The brown door belonged to a Quaker family named Tally, who lived in a farmhouse 2 counties north. Ferry poles indicated the crossing points where the water ran shallow enough for wagons. Old oak marked specific landmarks along hidden routes. Painted chapel meant this very building, where runaway souls could find shelter and guidance. "Dear God," Josiah whispered, "your mama was part of the network." She carried the map in music, passed it down in lullabies. Elias felt the world shifting beneath his feet. "What network?" Josiah rolled the quilt carefully, hands trembling slightly. "Underground Railroad, routes to freedom, marked in songs and patterns that slave catchers couldn't read. Your mama, child, she was a conductor, helped more souls to freedom than any of us knew." Liddy's eyes went wide. "Mama helped people get away? She helped them get home," Aunt Scylla corrected gently. "To the home the good Lord intended for them." Elias looked at the rolled quilt, then at Liddy's small face. "How many people know about this?" "Not many, and most of them are dead or gone north." Josiah tucked the quilt into a wooden chest behind the altar. "But if that child can sing the maps, she's carrying precious cargo in her head. Dangerous cargo, if the wrong people find out." The chapel seemed to grow darker, shadows lengthening as clouds passed over the sun. Elias thought about Rook's ledger, about the patroller's forged pass, about all the forces that wanted to reduce Liddy to a line item in an inventory. "What do we do?" he asked. "We trust the Lord," Josiah said, "and we listen very carefully to what he tells us through that child's songs." 3 days later, Elias brought Liddy to town under the pretense of carrying medicines to Dr. Cates. The doctor's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Main Street, with living quarters above and a back room where he prepared his more delicate remedies. Dr. Cates was a compact man with steady hands and spectacles that magnified his dark eyes. He'd studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to practice in his home county, and he treated all patients with the same careful attention, regardless of their ability to pay. "Brought you some help," Elias said, settling Liddy on a stool near the preparation table. "Girl's got good eyes for detail, might be useful with your measurements and such." Dr. Cates glanced at Liddy, taking in her watchful expression and careful posture. "Can you read, child?" "Yes, sir." "Letters and numbers both?" The doctor pulled a brown bottle from his shelf and set it before her. The label was written in Latin, with dosage instructions in careful script. "What does this say?" Liddy studied the bottle, turning it to catch the light from the window. "Tinctura, something with Q and U together. Quinini. For fever." Her finger traced the dosage line. "But this number's wrong, sir." Dr. Kate's eyebrows climbed. "Wrong how?" "Says 10 drops for a full-grown man. But that bottle there," she pointed to a different shelf, "says quinini's powerful strong. Should be 5 drops, no more." The doctor reached for his prescription book, flipping through pages until he found the entry. His face paled as he read. "You're absolutely right. 10 drops could stop a man's heart." He looked at Liddy with new respect. "How did you know that?" "Letters tell stories," Liddy said simply. "Wrong letters tell wrong stories. Dangerous stories." That afternoon, a field hand named Moses arrived at the doctor's office, carried in on a wagon bed, burning with fever from an infected cut on his leg. His family hovered around him, faces tight with worry, as Dr. Cates examined the wound. "Need to clean this out and get his fever down," the doctor said, reaching for the quinine bottle. Then he stopped, remembering Liddy's correction. 5 drops, not 10. He measured carefully, counting each drop aloud. Liddy watched, nodding approval. Within an hour, Moses's fever began to break. By evening, he was sitting up, taking broth from a spoon. "That girl saved his life," Dr. Cates told Elias as they walked back to the wagon. "Moses would be dead if she hadn't caught that error." Word spread quietly through the community. The enslaved girl who could read Latin, the child who caught mistakes that could kill, respect flickered in eyes that had seen too little reason for hope. But with respect came attention, and attention brought danger. On Thursday morning, Elias climbed to the attic of the big house, searching for his father's old papers. The space was hot and dusty, lit by a single window that looked out over the quarters. Trunks and boxes lined the walls, holding the accumulation of generations, clothes that no longer fit, furniture that had gone out of style, books that no one read anymore. Liddy had followed him up the narrow stairs, curious about the treasures hidden in the high places. She moved through the cluttered space like a moth, drawn to anything with words or symbols. A medical text caught her attention first, then a collection of sermon notes, finally a leather-bound Bible that lay open on top of an old trunk. "This one's different," she said, kneeling beside the Bible. Elias looked over her shoulder. The book was old, leather cover worn soft by countless hands, but something about the binding seemed wrong. Along one edge, he could see loose threads where the stitching had begun to separate. Liddy's nimble fingers worked at the threads, careful not to tear the fragile paper. "There's something tucked inside," she pulled gently, and a folded sheet of paper slipped free from the binding. It was different from the Bible's pages, newer, creamier, with a watermark that caught the dusty light, and along the top edge, a red wax seal that had been carefully preserved. Elias unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was written in his mother's careful script, dated 3 months before her death. "I, Eleanor Boone, being of sound mind and body, do hereby manumit and set free the following souls, to be released upon my death with full legal standing." A list of names followed. Most were familiar field hands and house servants who had indeed been freed after his mother's death, but one section made his heart skip. Ruth and her daughter, the girl called Liddy, to be granted freedom and safe passage to relations in Philadelphia, with provision of $50 gold and traveling papers. But something was wrong with the text. Water stains had blurred part of the writing. Wax from a candle had dripped across one name, obscuring it completely, and the locket that should have held Ruth's portrait mentioned specifically in the margin was missing. "My mama," Liddy whispered, reading over his shoulder. "She was supposed to be free." Elias's hands shook as he held the document. "You were supposed to be free. Both of you." But Ruth had died of fever 2 years ago, before anyone knew this paper existed. And Liddy had remained in bondage, her freedom trapped in wax stains and faded ink, hidden in the binding of a forgotten Bible. The attic seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. Through the small window, Elias could see Rook walking toward the big house, ledger tucked under his arm. The overseer's face wore its usual expression of cold calculation, but there was something new there too, impatience, urgency. "We have to show this to someone," Elias said. "The courthouse, a lawyer, someone who can make it legal." Liddy's fingers traced the blurred names, the missing portrait, the broken wax seal. Will they believe it? With all the mistakes and missing pieces? It was a good question, a very good question. The next morning, Elias rode to the county courthouse with the Bible document tucked inside his coat. The building stood in the center of town like a Greek temple, white columns supporting a portico where men gathered to discuss business and politics. Inside, the probate office occupied a corner room on the first floor. Clerk Haviland was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that had slipped down his nose. He examined the document carefully, holding it to the window light, checking the paper's watermark and the clarity of the handwriting. "This is irregular," he said finally. "Water damage, missing seal impression, smudged names, hard to authenticate properly. But it's my mother's handwriting," Elias said. "Her signature, her seal. Handwriting can be copied. Signatures can be forged." Haviland set the document on his desk, fingers drumming thoughtfully. "And then there's the matter of estate debts. Even valid manumissions can be voided if the estate lacks sufficient assets to honor them." Elias felt cold spread through his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that freedom papers are only as good as the estate that issues them. If the plantation can't pay its debts, the bank has first claim on all property, including human property." Through the office window, Elias could see Rook's wagon parked outside the general store. The overseer was talking with two men. Elias didn't recognize rough-looking fellows with the hard eyes of professional slave catchers. "How long do I have?" Elias asked. Haviland consulted a calendar on his desk. "Bank examination is scheduled for next Monday. If the estate's deemed insolvent," he shrugged. "Sheriff will likely authorize immediate liquidation of assets. Monday, 4 days." Elias rode home with the document burning like a coal against his chest. At the plantation, he found Liddy in Aunt Scylla's cabin, helping with the afternoon washing. She looked up as he entered, hope bright in her eyes. What did they say? He told her everything, the water damage, the missing proof, the bank's prior claim, the 4 days they had left. Her face grew still as death as she listened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she began to hum that hymn again, the one with the coded verses. "There's more to the song," she said quietly. "Parts Mama only sang when she thought nobody could hear." "What kind of parts?" Liddy's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the sound of water dripping from the wash basin. "When the judge sits cold as winter, when the law speaks hard and true, find the heart that beats for mercy. Let the righteous voice speak through. When the papers tell their stories, when the seals show true or false, trust the child who reads the letters. Trust the song that never lies." Outside, storm clouds were building on the horizon. The air smelled of rain and change, of the kind of weather that could wash roads clean or wash them away entirely. But in Aunt Scylla's cabin, 3 people sat in quiet determination. The child who could read the hidden meanings in seals and songs, the old woman who knew the true history of the plantation, and the young man who was beginning to understand that some inheritances were worth more than money, and some debts could only be paid with courage. 4 days to find proof that would stand up in court. 4 days to convince a judge that justice mattered more than ledger books. 4 days to keep a promise that a dying woman had sewn into the binding of a Bible, trusting that someday the right eyes would read it and the right heart would act upon it. The storm was coming. But sometimes storms washed away more than just roads. Sometimes they washed away the lies that people told themselves about what was legal and what was right. And sometimes, in the aftermath of the flood, truth rose to the surface like buried treasure, gleaming and undeniable in the fresh washed light. The storm struck on Friday night with the fury of an Old Testament judgment. Rain hammered the roof of the big house like grape shot, and wind howled through the cypress trees until their branches cracked like rifle fire. By midnight, the river had risen 6 feet above its banks, turning the low road into a rushing torrent that swept away everything in its path. Elias stood at his bedroom window, watching water claim the night. Lightning split the sky, revealing a world-transformed fence posts jutting from lakes where pastures had been, wagons floating like toy boats, barn roofs appearing and disappearing in the flood. But it was the light in Rook's house that worried him most. The overseer's window glowed steady and yellow, despite the late hour. Through the rain-lashed glass, Elias could see shadows moving more than one person, more than the business of a man waiting out a storm. A knock at the kitchen door sent him downstairs, boots echoing in the empty hallways. Aunt Scylla stood on the covered porch, water streaming from her oilcloth coat. Liddy pressed close to her side. "Cabin's flooding," Scylla said without preamble. Creeks jumped its banks, coming up through the floorboards. Elias pulled them inside, helping them out of their soaked wrappings. Liddy's hair hung in wet strands around her face, but her eyes were alert, watchful. She kept glancing toward the window that faced Rook's house. "They came for me," she said quietly. "3 men with ropes and a wagon. Would have taken me if the flood hadn't trapped their wheels. The patroller, him, and 2 others. Had new papers said they were from the bank, authorized to secure valuable assets before the courthouse hearing." Elias felt ice form in his stomach. "Where are they?" "Now?" Aunt Scylla nodded toward Rook's house. "Hold up there, waiting for the water to go down. But that patroller, he's not a patient man. Keep hearing him holler about getting that girl before she costs us all money." Through the kitchen window, they could see the light in Rook's window flicker as someone passed in front of it. Then another light appeared, a lantern moving from the overseer's house toward the main road, or what remained of it. "They're coming anyway," Liddy said, voice steady as stone. Water or no water. The lantern bobbed closer, joined by 2 more lights. 3 men slogging through knee-deep floodwater, using the fence line as a guide. The patroller led the way, his badge glinting wetly in the lantern light. "Backstairs," Elias said, grabbing a lamp from the kitchen table. "We'll go up to the attic, wait them out." But as they climbed the narrow servant stairs, Liddy began to sing soft and low, barely audible over the storm's rage. "When the water runs too high, when the road is washed away, follow sounds of distant safety, trust the song to guide the way." She paused, listening to something beyond the rain and wind. Her head tilted like a bird's, ears catching sounds that others missed. "That way," she whispered, pointing toward the front of the house. Church bells ringing. 3 strikes, pause, 3 more. That's the signal. Elias strained to hear. Through the storm's howling, he caught it, the faint bronze voice of the chapel bell, carried on the wind from 2 miles away. Preacher Josiah was calling the faithful to sanctuary, even in the middle of the flood, but the patrollers' voices were closer now, harsh and urgent as they surrounded the big house. A fist pounded on the front door, then moved to the kitchen entrance they'd just abandoned. "Boone," the patroller's voice cut through the storm. "We know she's in there. Banks authorized us to search every room if need be." Elias looked at Aunt Scylla, at Liddy's small face pale in the lamplight. The attic might hide them for a while, but morning would come eventually, and with morning would come a reckoning they weren't ready to face. Unless— "The back road," he said suddenly, "the one that runs along the ridge. Water might not have reached it yet." Liddy closed her eyes, listening to the storm with her entire body. Bells still ringing. 3 and 3 and 3. That's the hymn signal for safe passage. "You sure about that?" Her eyes opened, bright with certainty. Music doesn't lie, not when it comes from people trying to help. A crash from downstairs, the kitchen door splintering under the patroller's boot. Heavy footsteps on the wooden floors, voices calling rough commands as they began their search. Elias led them to a window at the back of the house, where a covered porch roof provided a path down to ground level. The rain struck them like a physical blow as they climbed out into the storm, but Liddy's voice rose above the chaos, guiding them with her soft singing. 7 steps from bank to board. When the bell strikes twice at midnight, trust the rope, believe the word. She led them through the flooded yard, water reaching their knees, then their waists. But she moved with uncanny certainty, finding the high spots, avoiding the deeper channels where the current ran strongest. Her song became their compass, pointing them toward safety they couldn't yet see. Behind them, lantern light blazed in the windows of the big house as the patroller and his men searched room by room. Angry voices carried on the wind, frustrated and increasingly desperate. But ahead, barely visible through the rain, another light appeared. A wagon lantern, moving slowly along what remained of the ridge road. And from the wagon came the sound of voices not harsh like the patroller's men, but warm and steady, singing the same hymn that Liddy hummed. Doctor. Kate sat on the wagon seat, reins steady in his hands as his horse picked its way through the flood debris. Behind him, under a canvas tarp, huddled several figures. Mrs. Tally, the Quaker woman, Preacher Josiah, and a man Elias didn't recognize, but whose gentle face suggested a friend rather than a foe. Heard the bell, Doctor. Kate's called softly as they approached. Figured folks might need help getting to higher ground. Elias lifted Liddy into the wagon bed, then helped Aunt Scylla climb up beside her. As he pulled himself over the tailgate, he heard shouts from behind the patroller's men had discovered their escape route. There, on the ridge road. Lanterns began moving toward them through the flood water, but slowly, hampered by the current and debris. Doctor. Cates clicked his tongue to his horse, urging the animal faster along the treacherous road. How far to the chapel? Elias asked. 1.5 miles. Preacher Josiah replied. But the road's washed out in 2 places. We'll have to trust the Lord and this young lady's ear for safe passage. Liddy was already singing, her voice barely audible over the storm, but somehow carrying perfect guidance. Follow moss upon the north side, where the old oak holds the lane, till you reach the painted chapel, where the peaceful hearts remain. The wagon lurched and swayed as Doctor. Cates followed her directions, turning where she pointed, stopping when she held up her hand, pressing forward when her song lifted with confidence. Behind them, the patrollers' lanterns fell farther and farther back, their owners unable to match the pace of a child who could read the flood like sheet music. When they finally saw the chapel's white walls gleaming through the rain, Elias felt something loosen in his chest. The building sat on a rise that the flood couldn't reach, surrounded by oak trees that had weathered storms for 100 years. Light glowed, warm and yellow in every window, and the bell in the small tower still rang its pattern of 3s, sanctuary, safety, hope. But as they pulled up to the chapel door, Liddy's song faltered. She sat up straighter in the wagon bed, listening to something new in the storm's voice. They found another road, she said quietly. Coming fast now, 3 horses, maybe 4. Elias looked back the way they'd come. Sure enough, new lights were moving toward the chapel, not the slow progress of men on foot, but the rapid approach of mounted riders who'd found higher ground and were closing the distance with dangerous speed. Inside, Preacher Josiah said, jumping down from the wagon. Quickly now. The chapel was warm and dry, lit by dozens of candles that turned the simple space into something magical. Other refugees from the storm sat in the pews, families whose cabins had flooded, travelers caught on dangerous roads, anyone who'd heard the bell's call and trusted its promise of safety. But safety was about to be tested. Hoofbeats thundered outside, followed by harsh voices and the jingle of spurs. The patroller had found them. A fist pounded on the chapel door. Open up. This is official business. Preacher. Josiah walked to the door but didn't open it. Church is in session, friend. You're welcome to join us in worship, but I'll ask you to leave your weapons outside. Don't play games with me, preacher. We're here for the girl, and we're taking her whether you like it or not. Through the windows, Elias could see more riders arriving, 6 men in total, armed and determined. They spread out around the chapel, cutting off any chance of escape, but Liddy stood up in her pew, small and straight as a candle flame. I want to tell them something, she said clearly. Preacher Josiah looked at her with concern. Child, you don't have to. I want to sing them the truth. She walked to the front of the chapel, where the quilt map hung behind the pulpit. Her voice rose clear and sweet in the candle-lit space. When the shallow belly rises, when the water runs too high, look for 3 lights in the darkness. 1 brown door beneath the sky. As she sang, something remarkable happened. The men outside grew quiet. The pounding on the door stopped. Even the horses seemed to settle, as if the music had some power to calm wild hearts. But Liddy wasn't finished. She sang all the verses she knew, the coded directions, the signals for safety, the map that her mother had carried in music and passed down in lullabies. And as she sang, the people in the chapel began to understand. This wasn't just a child's song. This was history. This was courage. This was the sound of freedom moving through the world like water through stone, patient and persistent, and impossible to stop. When the last note faded, the chapel held perfect silence. Then, from outside, a new voice spoke not the patroller's harsh command, but something softer, confused. "That song. I know that song. My grandmother used to sing it, back in Virginia. Said it came from the old days, when folks needed help finding their way home." One of the patroller's men, the youngest one, barely more than a boy, had dismounted and was standing by the chapel window. His face was wet, and not just from the rain. "Shut up, Billy," the patroller snapped. "It's just some darky nonsense." But Billy shook his head. "No, sir. That's a freedom song, and that little girl, she just saved us from drowning in the flood. Led us right to high ground when we would have gone the wrong way in the dark." The truth of it settled over the group like dawn breaking. These men had been following Liddy's voice through the storm, using her song to find safety. The child they'd come to capture had become their guide, their salvation, their unexpected guardian angel. The patroller's authority began to crack. Two more of his men dismounted, removing their hats as if they'd suddenly remembered they were standing outside a house of God. The storm was passing, and in its wake, something like conscience was stirring, but the patroller himself remained unmoved. "I don't care if she sang down the angels themselves. She's still property, and I'm still taking her." He spurred his horse toward the chapel door, hand moving to the pistol at his belt. But before he could draw the weapon, the flood water around the chapel began to rise again. A second surge, sudden and powerful, that swept his horse's legs from under it and sent both rider and mount tumbling into the dark current. Without hesitation, Liddy began to sing again, not the coded verses this time, but a different song, one that seemed to call across the water like a rope thrown to a drowning man. "Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." Her voice carried over the flood, reaching the patroller as he struggled against the current. And somehow, impossibly, it guided him to a fallen tree branch that he could grasp, then to a piece of floating debris that would bear his weight, finally to the shallow water near the chapel where willing hands could pull him to safety. Dr. Cates was among those who helped drag the half-drowned man from the flood. As they laid the patroller on the chapel steps, coughing up river water and shivering with cold and shock, the doctor looked at him with professional assessment. "You'll live," Dr. Cates said simply. "Thanks to that child you came here to steal." The patroller's eyes found Liddy, who stood in the chapel doorway with candlelight haloing her small form. Water dripped from his clothes and hair, but his expression had changed. The hard certainty was gone, replaced by something raw and confused and almost human. "Why?" he whispered. "Why'd you help me?" Liddy considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because the song told me to, and songs don't lie about what's right." As dawn broke over the song's flooded landscape, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the patroller's men helped him onto a dry horse and prepared to ride away. But before they left, the young one called Billy approached the chapel steps where Liddy sat braiding grass stems into a pattern that looked almost like music. "Miss," he said, hat in his hands, "I want to apologize for what we came to do, wasn't right." Liddy looked up at him, taking in his young face and troubled eyes. "You got a mama, Mr. Billy?" "Yes, miss. Back in Caroline County. What would she say if she knew you helped hunt children in the night?" Billy's face crumpled. "She'd take a switch to me, big as I am. She raised me better than that. Then you better do better, starting right now." He nodded, unable to speak. Then he mounted his horse and rode after his companions, leaving the chapel and its refugees to face the new day. But the danger wasn't over. As the flood waters receded, revealing roads that could be traveled again, new threats would emerge. The bank would still come calling, Rook would still have his ledger and his cold calculations, and somewhere in the county courthouse, papers waited to be signed that would determine whether a child's freedom was worth more than the debts of her dead mother's former owner. The real test was still ahead, not in the wild chaos of a flood, but in the measured deliberation of a court of law, where truth had to be proven with documents and witnesses, where a child's song might not be enough to outweigh a banker's arithmetic. But as Liddy sat on the chapel steps in the growing light, humming softly while she braided grass into patterns that held memory and meaning, she seemed unafraid. The music would guide her, just as it had guided them through the flood, and somewhere in that music, justice waited to be sung into being. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that follows violent storms washed clean, sharp-edged, pregnant with possibility. The courthouse square bustled with activity as people gathered for what had become the most talked-about hearing in the county's recent memory. Word had spread through the community like ripples on still water. The enslaved girl who could read Latin and sing maps, the plantation heir who defied convention, the documents that might prove freedom or condemn a child to sale. Elias stood on the courthouse steps, the stitched Bible page tucked inside his coat pocket, along with the locket they'd recovered from the smokehouse after the flood. Beside him, Liddy wore her one good dress, the blue cotton, clean and pressed, with her ribbon braided through her hair. She looked impossibly small against the marble columns and formal architecture, but her spine was straight and her chin high. The crowd pressed close around them. Townspeople in their Monday finest, plantation owners with calculating eyes, field hands who'd walked miles to witness something they'd never seen before, a child of bondage given voice in a court of law. Rook pushed through the crowd, his ledger clutched against his chest like armor. Behind him came two strangers in expensive suits, bank representatives, their faces cold as winter water. They moved with the confidence of men who'd foreclosed on dreams before and expected to do so again. "This is madness," Rook muttered, loud enough for nearby listeners to hear. "Giving credence to forged papers and a child's fantasy stories. The bank has prior claim on all assets. This hearing is just for show." "But, Doctor," Kate stepped forward, his medical bag in one hand and a thick folder of papers in the other. "Not just for show, Rook. This is about justice, about honoring the wishes of the dead and protecting the innocent." Mrs. Talley, the Quaker woman, nodded agreement. Her plain dress and bonnet marked her as different from the other spectators, but her presence carried quiet authority. "The child speaks truth. I've seen the proofs with my own eyes." Preacher Josiah climbed the courthouse steps, his worn Bible under his arm, "and I've heard the songs, coded directions that saved lives, including some folks in this very crowd." A murmur ran through the assembly. Several people nodded, remembering the flood night when Liddy's voice had guided them to safety. The young patroller named Billy stood near the back of the crowd, his face troubled but present, bearing witness to something he was still trying to understand. At precisely 9 o'clock, Clerk Haviland appeared in the courthouse doorway. "Court's in session," Judge Morrison presiding. "All interested parties, please enter." The crowd flowed into the building like water finding its level. The main courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding the doorways. Judge Morrison, a stern man with silver whiskers and steel-gray eyes, took his seat behind the high bench and surveyed the assembly with obvious displeasure. "This is highly irregular," he announced. "Probate hearings are typically quiet affairs, not public spectacles, but given the unusual circumstances and the number of interested parties, I'll allow observers to remain." However, his gavel struck the bench with sharp authority. "Any disruption will result in immediate ejection from this courtroom." Clerk Haviland consulted his docket. "The matter before the court concerns the estate of Eleanor Boone, deceased, specifically regarding alleged manumission documents discovered subsequent to her death. Present your evidence," Judge Morrison said to Elias. With trembling hands, Elias withdrew the stitched Bible page from his coat. The paper looked fragile in the harsh courtroom light, water-stained and delicate as moth wings. But the handwriting was clear, and the red wax seal still gleamed with authentic color. "This document was sewn into the binding of my mother's personal Bible," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "It bears her signature and seal, and explicitly grants freedom to several named individuals, including the child known as Liddy." Judge Morrison accepted the document and examined it carefully, holding it to the window light to check the paper's watermark. His face revealed nothing as he studied the handwriting, the seal, the list of names. "The handwriting appears genuine," he said finally, "but the document shows significant damage. Water stains have obscured portions of the text, and there appears to be a missing element, a portrait, or some form of additional identification." Rook stepped forward, his ledger open to a page marked with ribbon. "Your Honor, even if this document were authentic, which I question, it cannot supersede the legitimate debts of the estate. The plantation owes $17,000 to the Merchants and Farmers Bank. Until those debts are satisfied, no assets can be distributed. including human assets. The bank representatives nodded agreement, their faces smug with legal certainty. One of them rose and addressed the court. The bank's claim is documented and recorded. Mr. Boone's sentimental gestures cannot override lawful contracts. Judge Morrison frowned at the ledger, then at the Bible page, then at Liddy's small figure standing between Elias and Aunt Scylla. This is indeed problematic. The law is clear regarding creditors' rights in estate matters. Hope began to drain from the room like air from a punctured balloon. Several people in the crowd shifted restlessly, disappointment written on their faces. But Liddy stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, her young voice carrying surprising authority, "may I show you something?" Judge Morrison's eyebrows climbed. "You wish to address the court directly?" "Yes, sir." "About the papers and the seals and the truth that's written in them." The judge considered for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. But this is most unusual." Clerk Haviland brought a wooden crate from behind his desk, setting it in front of the judge's bench so Liddy could stand high enough to be seen by the entire courtroom. She climbed onto the crate with dignity, small hands smoothing her blue dress. "The patroller's pass," she said clearly. "The one he used to try to take us in the flood. May I see it again?" There was a stir in the courtroom. The patroller himself was present, standing near the back with his hat in his hands and his clothes still bearing water stains from his rescue. At Judge Morrison's gesture, he reluctantly approached the bench and produced the travel pass from his coat pocket. Liddy examined the document carefully, turning it to catch the light. "The Latin motto around the seal," she said. "It curves the wrong way. Should go left to right, but this one goes right to left, and the state wheat sprig is missing from the scales of justice." Clerk Haviland examined the pass under his Prife magnifying glass. "The child is correct. This seal is improperly executed. Furthermore," Liddy continued, "the red wax is the wrong color. True state seals use crimson mixed with carmine. This red has orange undertones, brick dust mixed with common candle wax." A murmur of amazement rippled through the courtroom. Judge Morrison leaned forward, studying the child with new attention. "How do you know these details?" "Letters and seals tell stories, Your Honor. I've learned to read the stories they tell, true ones and false ones." The patroller's face had gone pale. "You're saying my pass is forged?" "Yes, sir, and I can prove it." From her dress pocket, Liddy withdrew something that made the entire courtroom gasp, the small brass locket that had hung around her neck. But now it was open, revealing a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and Liddy's same stubborn chin. But more importantly, the back of the locket bore a clear impression in red wax, a perfect seal that matched exactly the one on Eleanor Boone's manumission document. "This locket belonged to my mama," Liddy said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She wore it every day until she died. The wax impression came from the same seal that marked the paper granting our freedom. Same color, same design, same wheat sprig, in the proper place." Elias stepped forward and placed the Bible document next to the locket on the judge's bench. Under the courtroom's bright lights, the match was undeniable. The wax impressions aligned perfectly, color, design, even tiny imperfections in the seal's metal surface that marked it as genuine. "Dear God," Judge Morrison whispered. "The documentation is authentic, but Rook wasn't finished. Your Honor, the bank's debt remains. Even authentic manumissions can be voided by insolvency." Before anyone could respond, Dr. Cates rose from his seat in the gallery. "Your Honor, I request permission to testify regarding this child's character and the value she has provided to our community." Judge Morrison nodded, and Dr. Cates walked to the front of the courtroom. His voice carried the authority of education and experience as he spoke. "This child saved a man's life by catching an error in a medicine dosage, a mistake that would have killed Moses Jenkins if she hadn't intervened. She reads Latin better than some college graduates, understands pharmacology that takes years to master, and possesses observational skills that would make trained investigators envious." Preacher Josiah stood up in his pew. "Your Honor, I'd like to testify as well." "Proceed. The songs this child knows aren't just music, they're historical documents. Maps coded in melody, passed down through generations to help people find safety. She carries knowledge that predates our written records, wisdom that has preserved lives and guided souls to freedom." "Missus," Tally rose next, her Quaker bonnet neat and her voice steady. I can confirm the routes described in her songs. My family has provided shelter for travelers following those very paths. The child speaks truth about matters that most adults have forgotten or never knew. One by one, members of the community stood to testify. Billy, the young patroller, spoke with a shaking voice about how Liddy's song had guided them safely through the flood. Field hands testified about her kindness and intelligence. Even some of the townspeople who had initially opposed the hearing found themselves speaking in favor of the child's freedom. But it was Judge Morrison himself who asked the most important question. "Young lady, if this court grants your freedom, what do you intend to do with it?" Liddy stood straighter on her wooden crate, looking out over the packed courtroom. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had thought deeply about the future. "I want to learn to read everything, Your Honor. Not just labels on medicine bottles and mottos on seals, but books and newspapers and legal documents. I want to help Dr. Cates save more lives. I want to teach other children the songs my mama taught me, so the knowledge doesn't get lost. And I want to use my freedom to help other people find theirs." The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the bank representatives looked uncomfortable, their legal certainty shaken by the child's simple dignity. Judge Morrison studied the documents one more time, comparing the wax impressions, examining the handwriting, weighing the testimony he had heard. Finally, he reached for his gavel. In the matter of Eleanor Boone's estate and the manumission document in question, this court finds the documentation to be authentic and legally binding. The seal impressions match perfectly, the handwriting is genuine, and the testamentary intent is clear. A ripple of excitement ran through the crowd, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. However, the matter of estate debts remains a valid concern. Therefore, this court orders the following resolution. The child known as Liddy and any other individuals named in the manumission document are hereby declared free persons under the law. But he held up a hand to quiet the celebration. The estate will compensate the creditors through the sale of land and other assets, not human beings. Rook's face darkened. "Your Honor, that may not be sufficient to cover the full debt. Then the creditors will have to accept partial payment," Judge Morrison said firmly. "This court will not reduce free human beings to chattel to satisfy financial obligations. The manumission stands as written." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. For a moment, perfect silence held the courtroom. Then someone began to clap slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. The applause spread through the crowd until the room rang with celebration. But Elias had eyes only for Liddy. She stood on her wooden crate, tears streaming down her cheeks, the brass locket clutched in her small hands. Free. The word seemed to shimmer in the air around her like heat waves on summer pavement. "Miss Liddy," Judge Morrison said gently, "do you understand what has just happened?" She nodded, unable to speak. "You are no longer anyone's property. You belong to yourself now, and to God, and to the bright future you're going to build with your gifts." As the crowd began to disperse, carrying news of the decision throughout the county, Elias walked over to where Liddy still stood on her makeshift platform. He held out his hand to help her down. But instead of taking his hand, she smiled the same gentle, radiant smile she had given him every morning at the quarters fence, but transformed now, by freedom, into something that could light up the world. The formalities took another hour, papers to be signed, witnesses to be recorded, legal documentation to be filed in the county records. But when it was finally finished, when Liddy's freedom was officially inscribed in the court's permanent registry, she walked out of the courthouse as a free person for the first time in her life. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden as the crowd gathered outside. Elias found himself thinking of all the mornings he had waited by the fence, hoping for a smile that would carry him through the day. Now he waited again, but this time he waited beside the courthouse rail where Liddy stood free and unbound, mistress of her own destiny. She looked up at him with dancing eyes. "What happens now?" "Now you decide," he said simply. "Your life is your own to choose." She considered this, head tilted thoughtfully. I think I'd like to start a school, right here in the county, where children like me can learn to read everything, medicine labels and legal papers, and songs and stories and maps. All of it." "I think that's a fine plan," Elias said, "and I think I know someone who might help fund such a school." Who? He gestured to himself with a small smile. Someone who owes you a great debt. Someone whose inheritance includes the responsibility to do right by the people who made his family's prosperity possible. As the sun set behind the courthouse, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they walked toward the chapel where Preacher Josiah was preparing for an evening service of thanksgiving. Behind them, the town square gradually emptied as people returned to their homes and their lives, carrying with them the memory of a day when justice had been sung into existence by a child's clear voice. But the story wasn't quite finished. 3 months later, on a warm evening in early autumn, lanterns hung like low stars from the oak trees around the country chapel. The building had been expanded with a new room that served as both schoolhouse and meeting hall, where children of all backgrounds came to learn their letters and numbers and the deeper truths that couldn't be found in any textbook. Liddy sat on the chapel steps, a slate and chalk in her lap, helping a younger child practice writing his name. Her hair had grown longer, caught back with the same blue ribbon, and her dress was new, a gift from Mrs. Tally, sewn in cheerful yellow cotton that matched her bright spirits. Inside the chapel, voices blended in evening hymn, not the coded songs of dangerous journeys, but simple melodies of gratitude and hope. Elias sang tenor, his voice weaving through the harmony alongside Dr. Cates's bass and Mrs. Tally's clear soprano. Even Billy, the young former patroller, had joined the choir, his voice rough but earnest as he learned new ways to use words for building up instead of tearing down. On the chapel steps beside Liddy, carved into the wood by loving hands, was the old broom handle from the quarters. Each notch had been carefully preserved, a record of rhythms remembered, of beats that had kept time for courage and hope during the darkest hours. As the final notes of the hymn faded into the gentle night, Liddy looked up at the stars emerging overhead. Somewhere in that vast sky, her mama's spirit rested, knowing that the songs had done their work, that the codes had been cracked, that freedom had been sung into being by a child who learned to read the truth in seals and mottos and the human heart itself. The ferry bell answered from far downriver, a bronze voice carrying across the water, calling to anyone who needed guidance, anyone who sought safe harbor, anyone who believed that some songs never end, but only change their melody as they pass from voice to voice, generation to generation, carrying hope like light across the darkness of the world.